This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek Radio and interviewing Lewis Clark, who's with Government Accountability Project.
The Government Accountability Project is an organization focused heavily on whistleblowers and supporting whistleblowers. And the one thing that we do is we represent whistleblowers as their lawyers. Secondly, is we investigate what they have to say, and then we try to create some kind of strategy around accomplishing the reform that the whistleblowers come forward to talk about. And then the third thing we do is we work on legislation for whistleblower protection.
Now, the effect of deregulation of a large amount of industry, how has that affected government oversight in agencies which are supposed to protect the American public and American workers?
Well, it's decimated the ability of the federal government to adequately protect consumers, adequately protect us all from health and safety threats. It's really been a disaster in terms of, and Congress continues to not appropriate sufficient funds in order to really protect the public. So it's really in a difficult phase right now. That's where whistleblowers come in.
And you're talking about like food, protection of food, the protection of drugs, the protection of health and safety on the job, or viruses or illnesses. I mean, it's a big, it's everyday life for working people.
Yeah, I mean,
the public.
There's a huge problem. So, deregulation by essentially not appropriating sufficient funds in order to do the job of protecting the public.
And these agencies, which have the task of protecting the public and organizing to investigate violations of the law, violations of health and safety laws or drug laws or food laws, what's happening in these agencies?
Well, what's really happening increasingly, and Congress is actually supportive of that, is they are depending more and more on whistleblowers to come forward and tell the agencies what's going on within a company. So they do depend on whistleblowers. And increasingly, Congress, for example, I mean, just one example, is they passed Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform. Lots of talk about Wall Street reform. But they didn't appropriate any sufficient funds in order to really regulate the banks. And so what ends up happening is Congress then enacts whistleblower protection to protect bank employees from coming forward, and that is helpful because that provides an ability for regulators to know what's going on. So essentially, Congress has punted to workers out in the corporate world to protect the public.
And what is the state of workers who do come forward on the job and see violations of the law, whether it's in finance or whether it's in health and safety or in their positions? What happens to them?
Well, often, they lose their jobs. Often, they end up essentially destroying their career. That is what often happens, but that's not what always happens. And so it just depends on whether the federal government is going to then step in and protect those workers who come forward. So what happens is that we're totally dependent on the federal government to protect the people who are the witnesses that the government needs in order to protect the public.
Well, if it's the case that in most instances workers lose their job when they try to follow the law and protect the public and themselves, why would workers speak out if they're going to lose their jobs? I mean, it seems it would have an effect of terrifying workers or intimidating workers that they're afraid to speak out about the violations that they see.
Well, there's no question there.
That's yours. Oh,
that's fine.
We'll
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's in my coat, probably.
That's okay.
Go ahead. It's in my coat. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, just turn it off.
Turn it off.
Oh,
okay. Here we go.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
Terrible.
That's okay.
All right.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
Those things happen. So why don't you talk about the effect that this has of workers being retaliated against for speaking up about what they see as violations of the law and protection of the health and safety of the public.
Well, there's no. I mean, it's absolutely true that when workers step forward and they get fired, it is a disincentive for everybody in terms of blowing the whistle. So that's why it's so important for the federal government to step in and stop that process. On the other hand, if the workers are not retaliated against and they're actually listened to and it makes a difference, a lot more whistleblowers will come forward.
Now, one of the areas that is of importance to working people is OSHA and the Department of Labor. And your group, your organization has been involved in trying to strengthen OSHA protection laws and whistleblowers. And what is happening at OSHA, and what is your organization sought to do to protect whistleblowers and protect people in the government who are investigating retaliation?
Yeah, well, let me step back just 1 second. Congress, again, wants whistleblowers to come forward from the industry. I mean, they've made that very clear because they have enacted legislation, strong legislation, to protect whistleblowers. So what needs to happen is the federal government has to stand up and help those workers who come forward and who are retaliated against. That's where OSHA comes in. So where OSHA comes in, they're the front lines of protecting the workers who step forward and blow the whistle. They are the front lines. They're absolutely critical. What they do is they investigate the retaliation, and they either stand behind the worker or the worker's in serious trouble.
And the question of the staffing of OSHA, apparently in the United States there are only 2,000 federal OSHA inspectors. Yep. You had a situation in Texas, West Texas, where they had the ammonia explosion. Right. There are only 89 inspectors for the entire state of Texas. That's run by the federal government. How can you expect that there to be real protection of health and safety when you only have 2,000 inspectors for 130 million workers in the United States?
No, you're right. I mean, the fact is that we do have a problem. There is inadequate staffing of the OSHA offices, and so there's no question that these offices all across the country are absolutely overworked. You know, they're actually supposed to be doing these investigations in often 60 days. Sometimes it takes 4 years to finish an investigation. So the quality and the quality of the work is also impacted, of course, by inadequate resources. Nevertheless, it's the responsibility of OSHA, if they are so overwhelmed in terms of the need, is they also need to speak up to Congress and ask for a vast increase in funding.
Well, even after the explosion in West Texas, right, President Obama went down there, and there was no mention even that OSHA was responsible for the health and safety of Texans, yeah, workers and the public. I mean, so it doesn't seem to be a high priority to raise that among the American people, that we need to really have proper staffing.
Yeah, and I think that's really where the American people need to step up. They need to learn about what's going on. They need to know that their voices are necessary too, to put pressure on the government. So the American public needs to step in, talk to their members of Congress, write letters, pressure in any way they can to see that OSHA is adequately staffed to do the job they need to do.
Now, one of the programs within OSHA is called the Whistleblower Protection Program. Right. Why don't you talk about that program and what's happened with the program and where it stands today?
Okay. Well, every region of the country is a little bit different, but what that office is, there are now 22 federal laws that have been passed that have whistleblower protections that require OSHA to essentially implement. And so this whistleblower protection office within OSHA, they're supposed to investigate when someone from the corporate world is retaliated against for possibly because they've spoken up. They're supposed to investigate those cases and then adjudicate the case if they find wrongdoing.
And one of the things that the investigator does for that agency is to issue merit determinations.
That's right.
And why don't you talk about that whole process?
Okay, what the process is OSHA will investigate an allegation of retaliation within the industry. So they'll do the investigation. After they finish their investigation, they will come up with a finding, in what you talk the merit finding, on behalf of the company or on behalf of the whistleblower, or the alleged whistleblower, or the possible whistleblower. And if they rule in favor of either one, the other side or the opponent can appeal that decision, and then have a hearing before an administrative law judge within the Department of Labor. And that hearing is like a full trial. And then that gets appealed up through the Department of Labor. It goes to a review board at the Secretary of Labor level. And then if either side doesn't like that decision and wants to appeal, it can go then to federal court.
And how long does this process take?
Years. It's meant to not take years, but it does take years. And so what Congress did in most of these pieces of legislation, they built in a way for within, let's say, 6 months. Sometimes some statutes are 1 year, some are a year and a half. But if the process is not completed within the Department of Labor within that period of time, the whistleblower can then opt out and just go right into federal court and get a jury trial in most of these, in most of the laws. They can actually get a jury trial in federal court and potentially win their case.
However, when you're facing big corporations,
right,
Chevron or FedEx or Lockheed Martin, what a likelihood of getting a quick result when you have lawyers who are being paid by these corporations basically to stall and to prevent a decision from taking place quickly.
Certainly you face a lot of lawyers on the other side. And so you do, and, in terms of resources, there's nothing equal about the situation. On the other hand, if you have a jury that is sitting there and watching 12 corporate attorneys on one side and one whistleblower on the other with maybe an attorney, juries have a way of looking at that situation and also discounting some of the evidence, or not discounting the evidence, but discounting some of the, let's say, the rhetoric that might come from the corporate side of things. So that's why jury trials are so important. Jury trial of your peers, which means people who are also employees, who also work, who also might be sympathetic to whistleblowers. So there's an element of justice that definitely comes into play there in court, as well as through the administrative law process within the Department of Labor. I mean, they do discount some of that talent that goes into just defeating the whistleblower. But I think a really important factor in terms of the law is that if the Department of Labor at that initial investigative process finds in favor of the whistleblower, the company has to take the whistleblower back into the job. And that whistleblower then has a job back with the company until the final case is adjudicated. Whether through court or whether it be adjudicated within the Department of Labor. That's an important factor in these investigations, because if the whistleblower now has the job back, then all of a sudden everything speeds up. All of a sudden we don't have a 5-year, 7-year wait for justice. All of a sudden what you have is a company that may want to get rid of that whistleblower, unfortunately, but might want to say, okay, we need to settle the case. So a huge incentive for the company to settle the case if the whistleblower is back in their midst.
And how many investigators are there in that whistleblower protection program?
I don't know. It's definitely under, it's under 2,000. I actually
It's
don't
around
have
500.
Is that right?
It's around 500.
Is that
And
right?
one of the issues of these merit determinations, what's the percentage of merit determinations versus investigations? And going on?
Well, every region is dramatically different. And I mean, one of the sad things about this region, the San Francisco region of the country, is there's only a 3% rate of finding in favor of the whistleblower. We think that's outrageous. We think the figure of 3% is not, it's just, is absurd.
And why is that?
I think what we're finding is that these cases are being essentially thrown, in our opinion, by the management of the Department of Labor, the OSHA office here in the San Francisco area. Cases where investigators are finding in favor of the whistleblower are reversed without finding additional evidence. They're just reversed by management. We are finding cases where people that really don't have any training are doing some of the investigations altogether, so they're not adequate. They're not adequately trained, and that includes some managers who are stepping into cases and are doing investigations, and they haven't even been trained. And we're also finding that they'll reverse their findings against the whistleblower if the whistleblower complains about how long the process is taking. There aren't many whistleblowers that probably most whistleblowers are going to complain if it takes years and years to finish an investigation. And so then what we're finding is that that's irritating to the management here in the offices here, and so some of those cases are being reversed against the whistleblower just because they complained. Other cases where the investigators are just finding in favor, the cases are just reversed without any kind of additional evidence, or the additional evidence that's added is added without the knowledge of the investigator themselves. Other times, investigators are just being told to reverse the decision without any kind of explanation of why that should happen.
Is that legal?
In our opinion, it's not legal, and we are challenging that.
Is that criminal violation of the law?
I wouldn't say it was criminal violation unless you could actually prove that they're doing it, through some kind of bribery, or to say it's criminal. But you are in the area of potential obstruction of justice. But I'm not sure we're prepared to say that it's criminal behavior. We are prepared to say it's illegal behavior.
Now, what happens when you do become a whistleblower is that you're subject to workplace bullying, harassment. Right. Is that an issue?
Oh, yeah.
For the protection of government whistleblowers?
Yeah. Oh, government whistleblowers are harassed like everybody, any other whistleblower. And if one of the things that happens in the whole whistleblower phenomena is the whistleblowers themselves are harassed, and then let's say the government officials or the investigators that side on behalf of the whistleblower, then they get harassed as well. It seems like people who not only are whistleblowers get harassed, but the people who support the whistleblowers or who find in favor of the whistleblower. They don't do that because they just like whistleblowers. They do that because that's what they find in terms of the evidence. But they find themselves being harassed as well.
So you're saying that there's workplace bullying and harassment of investigators for the Department of Labor, OSHA, who are finding in favor of whistleblowers on the job.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Here in this area of the country, yes. And we're not prepared to say that for every region of OSHA, but we do have evidence that strongly supports that allegation here in this area.
And the union, American Federation of Government Employees, I understand, has some grievances.
They have certainly raised grievances on this point. We support them in their grievances, and we
what
find
are their
they have
grievances about? What are they saying in their grievances?
Well, they're saying that management should not reverse the decisions that they have arrived at without any kind of evidence and without any kind of participation in that that decision. There has to be evidence if you're going to reverse the decision. I mean, that's a really basic point. These people are doing their job, and then all of a sudden they're reversed without any kind of additional evidence. As a matter of fact, the evidence indicates that where the pressure is coming from is from the corporate world. And so the management is participating in what we call ex parte communication with the corporations. In other words, they're having communication with corporate bosses, and then they're also reversing decisions.
Is that legal?
That's not legal.
And does David Michael, the director, chief of OSHA, and Tom Perez, the secretary of the Department of Labor, aware of this?
As I understand, they have been made aware of this, but what we're doing now is we're going to be presenting a fairly extensive presentation to the Office of Special Counsel in Washington, D.C., which is a whistleblower. It's an office for whistleblowers within the federal government. It's part of the civil service system. So we're going to be presenting this evidence, and then what we hope will happen is that office will then require an investigation at the Department of Labor, and will then have an investigation going on. I can guarantee that when that happens, when we file our complaint and when they're made aware of that complaint at the top offices of the Department of Labor, I guarantee at that point they are going to be hit with the evidence that we've presented.
And there's the case of Darrell Whitman, who is a lawyer, federal OSHA lawyer and investigator, who was one of those workers who was targeted, apparently, because he raised issues about merit determinations and changes of his merit determinations. What is going on with Darrell Whitman, and what happened with him?
Well, in our first of all, he was doing his job, and because he did his job too well, because apparently his job was to kill these cases rather than investigate them, and apparently his job was to essentially find against the whistleblower despite overwhelming evidence, and apparently his job was to listen to the management when he was told to do things, even though there was no added evidence that would justify a reversal of decision. So all this sort of management pressure, he continued to try to do his job, and they fired him as a result, in our opinion, as a result of his trying to follow the law as opposed to trying to please management.
And these companies, in one of his cases, Michael Maudry, who is a quality assurance engineer manager for Test America, which is owned by H.I.G Capital, Lockheed Martin, FedEx, PG&E. It seems that, according to Darrell Whitman, the big companies are not really prosecuted or not really taken to task. It's small contractors, small business people who face the brunt of OSHA regulation. Is that the case?
That's what we're finding as well, and we're finding that the companies with the clout are escaping the liability of the liability they should be facing for the actions they're taking against the whistleblowers within those companies.
Now, we discussed earlier deregulation going on within the government agencies. Do you think, as a result of the deregulation, these agencies, which are supposed to protect the workers and the public, have basically been captured by the very companies that they're supposed to regulate?
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. I will say this, is that we're finding that within various of the agencies. I don't know if I can say that we've done an investigation of all these. I will say is that what we have been looking at, we do think there's a lot of captures going on, certainly.
Now, Mr. Whitman, in compiling evidence or documents about what was the pressure on him to drop cases, the pressure on him to rewrite merit determinations that he was doing for workers, the pressure on him and the workers that he was investigating, sent letters to Chief Michaels and also Tom Perez, saying that there was corruption in the agency and there was obstruction of justice. What happened to his appeals, which he tried to do internally to get some rectification of the issues that he found in the agency?
I mean, it's been our experience with the whistleblowers, and Mr. Whitman, certainly a good example of that, is that 99% of the time they have presented all their evidence or most of their evidence to all up the chain of command. So by the time by the time action is taken against them, they have certainly exhausted they've exhausted the chain of command anyway, in terms of presenting their concerns. And is a good example of that. He did that. I can't, I cannot, I don't know if the top officials of the Department of Labor read all his material or not, or someone else did. I don't know. But at least every indication is that he did everything he could possibly do up the chain of command, which he does not have to do by law. He doesn't have to go up the chain of command. It's just that they almost always do. Almost every whistleblower does. And then, so the company, in this case, certainly the Department of Labor, had every chance to make efforts to correct some of the problems that are going on. That's not happened so far.
Well, Tom Perez is well regarded among the unions in the United States, and he's been seen as somebody who protects workers' rights. Why wouldn't he take action to defend Darrell Whitman, an employee in the Department of Labor, who feels he's being pressured, and other people in that agency being pressured to basically throw cases for the corporations?
I can't get into. I don't know what the thinking process is of anyone such as that. So I just can't answer that question.
Now, what you're suggesting now is you're going to make a report, and you're going to send it where?
Well, it's going to be a complaint, and so it's not going to be just a report. We're going to file a complaint with the Office of Special Counsel on two aspects of the situation. One is about all the problems that are going on within the organization or within the office. In addition to that, we're going to be filing a complaint on behalf of Mr. Whitman in terms of how he's been treated. So there'll be two different complaints that will be going forward.
Now, the Office of Special Counsel, do they prosecute government officials who violate the law and conduct themselves illegally? They do have some authority to do that in some situation. I'm not expecting that necessarily to happen because really where that decision really has to be made is the Office of Personnel Management. But what they can do is they can they can investigate, they can force the agency to do an investigation. They can then evaluate the investigation that the agency conducts. So I'm talking about the Department of Labor. And then they can report to the President and to the Congress about the inadequacies of that investigation if that's what they find. So if they don't think the concerns were adequately investigated at the agency, they have the power to raise it up to the level of essentially Congress as well as the level of the White House as well. Well, Mr. Whitman, Darrell Whitman, has said that he believes that there's criminal violations of the law, that falsifications of documents, and also he's alleging that the top officials are aware of that. What basis is there to believe that the government is going to investigate itself at this point? The Department of Labor and Tom Perez, or even President Obama, is going to investigate his own department and go after the potential criminals in his own department.
Well, I mean, every department of government has inspector general offices that certainly with a capacity to investigate those agencies. There's a certain level, depending on the department, of independence for those inspectors general. In the case that we're talking about now, there is a statutory inspector general within the Department of Labor. We presume it's going to do its job, and they also have the power to refer cases to the Department of Justice if they believe that that's necessary in terms of criminal activity on the part of government officials.
Well, there's a growing distrust among people in the United States that the corruption, and it seems like there's corruption that you are talking about in the Department of Labor and OSHA and the Whistleblower Protection Program. that actually it's going to be addressed. Would you support an independent prosecutor being appointed to investigate this case, since it appears that David Michaels and Tom Perez were both informed about the harassment, the bullying, and potential criminal violations of the law?
I'm not. We're not ready at this point to call for a special investigation or the appointment of a special prosecutor until these processes have shown themselves to either work or not work. And so there might be a time later on where.
But this could be years.
You're right. It could be
this
years.
could be 5-10 years.
I agree with that.
And what does that leave the American people, the workers, and these workers in OSHA, and also workers who complained about their health and safety? They seem to be hung out to dry. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, there's no question that justice is going to be delayed in this circumstance.
Isn't that justice denied? Justice delayed and is justice denied.
And there's no question that could be end result, but we also think that the evidence is so strong that we think there might be action short of the need for a special prosecutor, but we'll see.
Now, the program, Whistleblower Protection Program, has had some people appointed to it who have tried to clean it up or try to deal with the problems, but it seems that they themselves have been fired or removed in the history of this agency, the Whistleblower Protection Program. Are you aware of the top management being removed who were trying to investigate the problems of?
Well, I can only speak about the cases where we've investigated and that we've gone forward. So I do know these allegations are out there, and those concerns are certainly out there in terms of perception. But until we actually do our investigation, I don't think that we're prepared to say that this has occurred.
Well, there have been some investigations by the government themselves of this agency.
Right.
And of the lack of their determinations, the lack of consistency, the lack of doing the investigations on time.
No, I agree. I totally agree with that, and we do know those investigations, and we agree with that. But I thought you were going further in terms of findings of actually.
Well, what I'm saying is it seems like the government has already had some investigations in which, out of those investigations, they reported that the Whistleblower Protection Program was not adequately doing the investigations in a timely way, following up, and that the level of the percentage of merit determinations was very, very low. And it wasn't just a isolated case, but it was a general problem in the entire
Absolutely. And essentially disastrous management. I mean, it's really been heavily criticized. I don't think the criticism went to the point of saying that that the people who have raised those have been harassed, intimidated, and forced to resign. I don't, but I mean I could be wrong about that. I just don't know.
Well, Darrell Whitman is a lawyer and was an investigator, and other lawyers in his office were harassed and bullied.
I agree. That's what our finding is too. I mean, we are finding a lot of support for those concerns.
What is your organization going to do to get this out there so people understand the importance of this? Because most people are unaware, in many cases, even that what happens when you do file legitimate health and safety complaint and then are retaliated against.
Well, we are certainly going to take the issues and certainly our findings, and we're going to bring the issue up to certainly to Congress. We're going to raise the issue within the media world. We're hoping that we'll get essentially national attention to the problems that we're finding out here.
And it seems like more and more there's a system breakdown.
Yeah.
It's not just one department. I mean, FDA. I mean, one agency after another. Where is this going?
First of all, I think that some of essentially the reaction in terms of the voting that's occurring this year, there is a certain level of evidence that the American people are getting rather frustrated with the government. and I'm very frustrated with how the government has handled these kinds of problems and these kind of issues. And so trust in government is down.
Well, if it's the case that these agencies, FDA for example, or OSHA, or the airline FAA, have been captured by these corporations, how do you change that dynamic? I mean, if you have systemic corruption, and if these agencies have actually been captured by the corporations that they're supposed to regulate, do you think that that's going to be solved by an investigation, or I mean, it seems like it's a system problem. It's not just individual people,
Right.
and even not just one department, but many departments.
Right.
I mean, the departments of whistleblowers that your organization represents are probably from many, many agencies.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you really do have to, you have to identify the problem with the evidence, and that needs to be presented. And when it is, then the American people really have a choice. I mean, they can let their voices be known as well, in support of the whistleblowers. Within companies, certainly whistleblowers within government as well. They need to raise their voices in support of the people who are actually seeing the problems, raising them, and then doing everything in their power to fix those problems and those problems that they've identified.
Now, some people have said that if there is violations of the law, that the government officials should be prosecuted if they're colluding with corporations. What's your view about prosecution of these corporations which are colluding with the government to avoid liability and to stop protection of whistleblowers?
Depending, of course, on the evidence. I mean, if the evidence is that they have bribed the government officials, which probably it would be very hard to prove, but if there's evidence that's a corporate, I mean, that's a crime. But it depends on what kind of pressure they're putting on, what kind of pressure they're putting on the government, and it also depends on how they're rewarding people who are doing their bidding. And so if that's what we're talking about, then those people need to be prosecuted.
Well, in the case, one allegation that Mr. Whitman has made is in the case of Lockheed Martin, a whistleblower who said that there were problems with the air weather reporting and privatization of that agency was retaliated against, and that there was a secret meeting between representatives of Lockheed Martin and OSHA, and that led to basically his merit determination being denied and him losing his case. Should those corporations be prosecuted for colluding with the government to limit their liability secretly?
Yeah, I mean, again, if the evidence is there of the criminal behavior, then yeah, they should be prosecuted.
And who is going to prosecute these
The Department of
corporations?
Justice, which doesn't do it. I mean, it really does. It does come down to the Department of Justice.
And what do you mean it doesn't do it?
Well, the Department of Justice, for example, in the banking industry, as we all know, the banks took us to the brink of absolute financial collapse, not just our country, but the world. And yet, not one banker has been prosecuted for the behavior of the banking industry that took us to the brink of collapse. And what we were talking about in many of those cases was just bank fraud. I mean, all the talk about the reason that there wasn't prosecution is because there was deregulation of the banks, so therefore they couldn't prosecute the banks, is wrong. Bank fraud is bank fraud. And when you are buying mortgages, for example, 80% of which you know is defective, and I'm talking about the top officials of banks, and when you're buying these mortgages, you know they're defective, but you're continuing to do it because you're able to securitize those mortgages and then offer them as investment opportunities for people. And it's all based on the fiction that we all know that real estate is going to continue to go up in value, so therefore the fact that they're defective mortgages won't make a difference in the long run. I mean, it's disastrous. And when you get down to those, okay, let's look at the defective mortgages. What you have are a bunch of people who are being forced into or pressured into signing mortgages that they can't possibly afford. But even worse than that is in the cases of some of the banks is what they did is they just essentially they took their name or their signature on a mortgage document, application, and they put it on another document that had different terms. So essentially, so some of the poor people who have signed up for mortgages they couldn't afford, they didn't even know that. I mean, they didn't even sign the document that ended up, being, pushed into the whole, securitization process. I mean,
Well, in the
and yet
case
no
of,
one was prosecuted.
I mean, the big banks. No, none of the big bankers have gone to jail. There's a movie, The Big Short,
Right.
which is about
Exactly.
illegal activity, and of course you have Pfizer, which Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, said was too big to kneel.
Yeah.
You couldn't prosecute a big company.
Right.
What does that say about reforming the system when the biggest corporations in the America and the world are basically unaccountable and not being prosecuted for flagrant violations of the law?
Well, to step back one step, what has happened as a result of the failure to prosecute is the Department of Justice has at least publicly taken a different stance. They're now saying that they're going to prosecute bank fraud. We'll see if they do that. But and the only reason that they've changed their position, I mean, actually, their position internally to the Department of Justice is that what kept them up at night, I mean, this exact quote, what kept these high government officials up at night is the fear of what would happen to those institutions if they were charged with a crime. And that's what kept them up at night. I mean, it didn't keep them
Couldn't
up.
those institutions be taken over, nationalized?
Yes.
So that's
They
a
could be. That is the solution.
They don't want to talk about that.
No, they don't want to talk about
Yeah.
that. But I mean, but the but the fact but the fact is that I mean, so what happened is the Department of Justice defended the banks as they were engaged in fraud, did not take action against them, and then when the collapse happened, they doubled down because then when we're in this free fall, economically, they were even more fearful of what would happen if a particular company or bank failed. And so then they get added protection when the thing was collapsing. And then when it's all over with, now they're changing their rhetoric about whether they're willing to prosecute. I don't know what's going to happen, but I will say is that if the American people as a whole don't hold the government officials responsible, or don't take action in terms of pressuring the government to prosecute, then it's not going to happen.
Well,
people have to be involved.
We have a capitalist government. We have capitalist parties, and the capitalists control the economy here and around the world. What gives you reason to believe that the capitalists are going to reform themselves and prosecute each other for violations that they're doing, like in the banking, and put themselves in jail?
Well, I'm not sure they're going to put themselves in jail, but at the same time, if there are consequences for continuing their behavior that we've seen in the past, if there are consequences, that behavior will change. If they don't, then we'll get another round of economic collapse, and perhaps we won't pull out of this one.
Do you see that coming? Because apparently there are no prosecutions, major prosecutions, and there continuing to be violations, that are going on in many, many ways. I mean, of what's in the economy.
I don't think there's enough evidence to say that the same things in terms of the level of fraud that was going on before the collapse is continuing on. I'm confident that if we had whistleblowers who come forward, we'll then have that evidence. It really is going to come down to the whistleblowers coming forward. The whistleblowers before the Wall Street reform, Dodd-Frank whistleblower reform, had no protection in the banking industry. Now they do. With that protection, we have people inside banks that could come forward and tell us what's going on there. And it's possible that we'll have a different scenario than we did before.
Well, in the case of Darrell Whitman, on as far as the laws are concerned, does have protection.
Oh yeah.
That people in the banking industry don't.
Well, they do.
They didn't have. They have now, and yet in his case, he hasn't been protected, and he's been fired. So here he is. He has protection, and he's still been fired, and it seems like that he's out of work right now.
Yeah, he is out of work. He is out of work right now. I'm not sure he's going to continue to be out of work. I should think he's going to win.
How long do you think this will take?
I don't know. I would hate to. We have one case that's been going on for 9 years, but we have one at the Supreme Court recently.
What case is that?
That's Robert McLean. He was the air marshal, blew the whistle on the decision at TSA, Transportation Safety Administration. He blew the whistle on their decision to stop putting air marshals on transcontinental flights in the middle of essentially a terrorist alert, a confirmed terrorist alert on exactly those kind of flights. And he blew the whistle on that to the media. He was fired. It took us 9 years. It went to the Supreme. We actually won below at the court. It was the government that took it to the Supreme Court, but we won at the Supreme Court, and he has now been reinstated after 9 years. And so, eventually, we hope to prevail in the case of Mr. Whitman as well.